The Inherently Fearless Condition, a talk by Avatar Adidar Samraj. Devotee. Beloved Lord Adidar Samraj, I have a question about your teaching on mortality and my sensitivity to an aspect of it. Your teaching on death and dying has been an enormous boon to me. Easy Death is the first book written by you, and I read, and your direct intervention in my father's death was a huge grace to him and me and my family. I have studied your talk, The Dual Sensitivity at the Origin of the Divine Way of Adidam, many times. In that talk, you say that one must do sadhana on the basis of the acknowledgement of the profound fear of death and the acknowledgement of fear altogether. I feel I have understood more about fear altogether in recent years, but I am not really sensitive to the fear of death in specific. Adidar. If you're not afraid of death yet, do not be concerned. You will be. Devotee. The question arose because in reading that talk many times, I was struck by the fact that I seem to be more aware of other kinds of fear. Adidar. Like what? Devotee. Just a kind of generalized fear of physical threat, being in the city. Adidar. This does not seem to you to have some relationship to fear of death. Devotee. Yes, it does. Adidar. Being anxious in the city. Anxious about what? Difficult, terrible things that can happen? Yes. Well, what difference would such things make if you were actually not afraid of death? Devotee. So all those forms of fear are extensions of the fear of death. Adidar. What would you say about it? Extensions or are? Devotee. So in some sense, all fear is fear of death. Adidar. What would you say about it? What is the content of it as fear? What is it threatening? Devotee. Some kind of threat of extinction. Yes. Adidar. Threat of extinction. Yes. Loss of objects, loss of the ability to experience, loss of existence altogether. Devotee. Yes. Adidar. Such things are just words used to describe something very fundamental, but simply stated, it certainly sounds like fear of death. Wouldn't you say? Devotee. Yes, beloved. That makes sense. Somehow I was drawing a line, presuming that what I was feeling was not really fear of death. Well, not yet. That all fear of death is about something that is not yet. Otherwise, you would already be dead. Until you are dead, you fear death. And then, when you are actually dead, it has already happened. Maybe then you are afraid of something else, but in any case, fear of death is always previous to death itself. You are afraid of death then? Is that what you are saying? Yes, very clearly. In fact, you are afraid of virtually everything. Yes, that's true. Omniphobia. Yes, that summarizes it, beloved. Omniphobic. So you do, in fact, have some sensitivity that you fundamentally describe as fear of death. What about it? Is there a question then? I think you answered it, beloved. I think it was something about not wanting to connect all that other fear to death, or somehow trying to keep that at a distance. It seems clear from what you have said that all fear is an extension of fear of death. The ultimate fear is fear of extinction or of, as you say, loss of objects, loss of life. Adidar, there is also something more profound about it than that, since it is not about your not being afraid of death, but in fact is fundamentally fear of death that you are describing in life. What is there to understand about it? What is it exactly? For fear of death is not a characteristic of death. Fear of death is a characteristic of life. You do not know what the characteristics of death are until you are not even merely dying, but actually dead. And then you will know what that is, if you are capable of knowing at all. You are also afraid of that. Maybe you will not be capable of knowing anything at all. And all of this, of course, has something to do with your fundamental ignorance of your actual condition and the nature of reality. You are identified with the body-mind, and this is one of the characteristic experiences. But why is it a characteristic experience associated with being alive? Virtually anyone could have asked me a question similar to yours and wound up confessing that they are in fact aware of being afraid of death. And such fear is rather generalized and in some sense covers his or her entire life and is more or less a constant, like a constant background noise or background sensation or background emotion to virtually every moment of life. Although you try to ignore it or become diverted from it, you are fundamentally afraid, and you do not particularly like it, it would seem. Devotee, no, beloved. But you also have not entered into the examination of it very profoundly, because until a couple of minutes ago, you did not even acknowledge that you were afraid of death. You could not identify fear in these terms. Fear is inherently associated with self-contraction. It is the native mood of self-contraction. It is the emotional mood of the ego. It is the primal emotion of egoity. It is not merely fear of death. It is the primal emotion of egoity. It is identifiable in natural terms relative to natural events and to fears associated with the current grasping onto body-mind states and not wanting to lose them or the capability for them. Therefore, this fear has an even more profound context, remarkably enough, than death. Fear is the fundamental action of life, showing itself emotionally. If that action is transcended, then fear is transcended. There is a condition prior to fear in which there is no fear. Of course, this must be realized, but it is so. And Adidar says, I am it. I am that prior condition. Well, he says that to me. And if that condition is realized, then all of conditional existence is transcended. All the implications of body-mind are transcended. All of the fundamental ignorance associated with egoity and identification with conditional states is transcended. It is also not an attainment of the body-mind. It is not a state to be created or achieved as a result of some transformation of the body-mind itself. Although there is something about the egoic bondage to the body-mind and the characteristic act of the body-mind that certainly must be transcended in order for this realization to become self-evident. Having entered into the domain of this inherently fearless condition, all inclination to be in some lesser state, conditioned by limitations on death, is displaced, such that a profound process begins, leading to the perfect practice of the way of Adidam. The divine self-condition must be realized. It cannot be realized by acts of the body-mind. It is not a philosophical matter merely. There are certain kinds of noticings that can occur for a moment, but realization is not that. It would seem that most perfect divine self-realization is the condition in which your worst fears will be perfectly and completely realized. You want nothing to do with realization. You seem to want everything to do with bondage because you fear the implications of the realization of truth, of reality, not merely the implications of death. You fear the loss of egoity and the egoic position, even though that position is precisely the condition in which death is guaranteed. The ego is what is, in fact, going to die. There are no two ways about it. It is not only going to die, a little bit, it is going to die in every fraction, gross, subtle, and causal. All of it will go. There can be transformations of conditional existence in the meantime, but ultimately all of it goes, just as in physical death, the gross part goes. There would still be inevitably processes of subtle and causal nature producing more modes of transformation and so forth, in the midst of which there would be the same bewilderment, the same self-contraction, the same defensiveness, the same protection of ignorance and of egoity itself, the same failure to identify suffering as such for real and to identify it as your own activity, and the same fundamental unwillingness or obstinacy, the same conviction somehow or other arrived at. It somehow seems logical that it is not desirable to realize reality, truth, real God. Not desirable because it requires loss of self. You began by saying you were not in touch with the fear of death. What you're actually afraid of is God, and not in any positive sense. You are afraid to surrender because surrender is the relinquishment of the very thing you are defending. Thus, your question about the fear of death is, in truth, an expression of the refusal to surrender. You would prefer to be the one of those who escape all bad consequences and bad events, wouldn't you? Yes, beloved. So even fear of death is, in a sense, dishonest. It is a kind of misunderstanding of what fear is about. Most people spend their entire lives being carried by a fundamental anxiety that sometimes becomes fear or even terror. This ride on the degrees of the fundamental underlying emotion that they identify with, the fear of death, and that they think death implies or suggests, since they do not know exactly what goes on in death. It is as if you were pinching yourself. Fear of death is simply the emotion that most fundamentally characterizes the basic symptom of egoity itself, of ego possession, of separativeness. Separateness from what? Separation into fear itself. Fear of death is a reaction to the condition in which you are actually existing, not merely a feeling of being threatened by what is yet to occur, but a refusal of that which is always already the case, a refusal of the condition that is actually the case, in the apparent now. Yet you think there is something about that you do not like, that something about it is to be avoided. You misidentify the divine reality, thinking that it is death, whereas the divine reality is not itself literal, natural death. Nevertheless, the divine reality is associated with implications that you, in your self-contraction or your identification with the body-mind, fear. There is no body-mind in the divine self-condition, so you identify the divine self-condition as something negative. You are avoiding it by means of self-contraction. And now you are here, and that is why. Not merely here in this room, but here in this apparently mortal condition, in this state of imagination in which you are bewildered, afraid, asking questions, trapped as they are between a rock and a hard place. You cannot wholeheartedly embrace conditional existence, and you cannot get out of it. Just to exist is to feel trapped. Just to exist is to feel fear, which you cover up with diversions, so that your fear is just a mumbling anxiety for as much waking time as you can possibly keep it at that low-grade level. It could be, he snaps his fingers, put out in an instant. Unfortunate conditions could come out of nowhere, and fear would overwhelm you physically, beyond coping in the physical sense. Ultimate fear cannot be coped with physically. It shatters the body, and so death would be inevitable. Death is going to happen anyway, and by tendency, fear will be associated with it. So would you prefer to go on in this between a rock and a hard place kind of squeeze, or does it make any sense to you to be surrendered to reality itself? Devotee, yes it does, beloved, absolutely. Adiel says, by realizing the divine reality itself, by responding to that one through tacit recognition, that is the recognition of me that makes devotion. My devotee must be carried by that, moved by it, instructed by it, until the effort of self-contraction is no longer unconscious and overwhelming and bewildering, and at last is most perfectly transcended. What possible argument could there be against that? Devotee, none, beloved. It is necessary then to know this, to receive my avataric divine person and my avataric divine teaching word, and be grounded in the real sadhana of the way of Adidam, instead of constantly shape-shifting with one foot in the world and one foot in the sacred domain, always double-talking yourself into ambiguity and a banal condition of bondage. There is nothing about presumed separateness that is not afraid. All presumed separateness is embedded in fear, utterly identical to fear. Therefore, there must be growth in responsibility for the act that is creating the illusion of separateness, and with it, all the accompanying illusions, the illusion of otherness, the illusion of relatedness, the illusion of difference. All of your perception at the present time is characterized by these four things, such that you presume that these are fundamental categories of reality. You are you, a separate however you describe yourself, body, mind, ego, I, point of view. There are others here. Relative to any other, you are in relation rather than identical to them. And there are differences between all things observed. Therefore, it seems that these are the necessary categories of reality. In fact, they are not. They are utterly self-made. They are illusions of your own making. They have no reality whatsoever apart from that. And so, you are afraid. It says in one of the ancient scriptures of India, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, wherever there is another, fear arises. Or wherever there is self-contraction, fear arises. In other words, otherness is a fundamental illusion of egoity. If there is the perception of an other, or the perception or feeling sense that one is separate, if there is the feeling sense or observation of relationship as the condition or status of separate self over against an other, if there is even the slightest perception of difference, fear arises. Fear is inherent in these states. Fear is inherent in self-contraction. Fear is the characteristic mood of egoity. If separateness, otherness, relatedness, and difference were simply and really the case, why would there be fear? It is the case because of the not, the self-contraction that is making them. When do you feel pain? When there is a constriction of the natural flow, such as blood and nerve energy, or energy altogether, then there is pain. When energy is free-flowing, it feels balanced. So what is this fear? It is a constriction. That constriction exists wherever there is the sense of separateness, otherness, relatedness, and difference. Fear is never absent wherever there is that presumption. In that condition in which there is no separation, no separateness, otherness, relatedness, or difference, there is no fear, inherently none. When, by my avataric divine spiritual grace, everything that arises is divinely self-recognized, then there is freedom from the illusion of separateness, otherness, relatedness, and indifference. In the demonstration of self-abiding, divine self-recognition, those characteristics are utterly absent. They are not characteristics of reality itself. Therefore, even conditional manifestation is free of this imposition. This is why the seventh stage demonstration is most ultimately an outshining of all conditions. The seventh stage realization is not characterized by dissociation, but by self-abiding divine self-recognition. In the egoic state, there is no divine self-recognition. You do not see the way things are. You see them as things not as are. Being is hidden. Its nature is hidden. The current of being is hidden. The spiritual force of existence itself is limited, even apparently absent. It is not enough to let the tourniquet slip a little bit. It must be cut, absent, no separateness, no otherness, no relatedness, no difference, none, no ego. Reality is inherently egoless. Fear is inherently ego-bound. Yet the body remains the body even in the state of realization. If someone who is awakened is walking through a jungle and tigers leap out from both sides, or 12 raptors come from all directions, the sudden reaction will be fear. It is a life-saving reaction. it can be seen to be perfectly intelligent and usable under the circumstances. It is a consistent underlying fear coincident with ignorance or identification with the body-mind that is transcended in most ultimate awakening. Things as they merely appear remain as such. The force of divine self-recognition is simply divine self-abiding until its very brightness outshines conditions. It is not that one becomes merely comfortable being embodied. Rather, embodiment is transcended. Indeed, embodiment is not so. Even in all the appearances of naturalness, it is not so. And in due course, it is outshined. Divine translation is that outshining. In the meantime, there are the natural appearances, but the abiding condition is egoless. There is no root perception of separateness, otherness, relatedness, or difference. There is no obstruction in conscious awareness. There is no tourniquet or knot in the force of being, the spiritual or love-blissful current of divine existence. Most ultimately, that current shines through and beyond, such that everything is vanquished in its fullness. Thus, ego transcendence and most perfect realization of the egoless divine self-condition is a kind of death, but merely natural death that comes in due course, not merely natural death that comes in due course, but divine self-realization is the death you actually fear, and yet it is not to be feared in the slightest. You are only afraid in the absence of divine self-realization, in your contraction from it. Then your fear becomes your lifelong preoccupation. It is also said traditionally that even a little bit of the law, the Dharma, the truth, casts out much fear. As you enter more deeply into the course of surrender in heart communion with me, you are tacitly and thereafter more and more profoundly established in this condition, which is prior to egoity, and which is therefore inherently fearless.